Welcome to the Saint John Vianney Center's podcast, Journey to Thrive. I'm Dr. Don Marks. I'm an associate professor and the director of clinical training at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, and I'm a consulting psychologist for the Saint John Vianney Center. Today, I'll be talking about the psychology of burnout, discovering compassionate alternatives to the experience of emotional exhaustion. I want to begin by talking a little bit about what burnout is. Burnout is typically defined as a psychological response to a professional or vocational situation that features these three characteristics: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, kind of fatalism, and also depersonalization, lack of warmth or interest in interpersonal relationships, and reduced professional effectiveness or sense of personal accomplishment. Now, that can look differently in different people. So how burnout looks is somewhat dependent on the situation and the person. But some of the signs of burnout can include irritability, apathy, a sense of demoralization, maybe giving up or feeling like the situation is impossible. But it can also include things like intrusive thoughts, perhaps intrusive memories of a situation that didn't go well, perhaps in a healthcare setting, intrusive memories of a bad outcome. It can include sleep disruption or insomnia. Oftentimes, people are at risk for heightened substance use. They'll be more inclined to use alcohol after work or to use prescription medication as a way of trying to reduce their contact with unpleasant or unwanted emotions. And overall, burnout yields reduced quality of life. So there are a lot of different consequences of burnout. It's been associated with a variety of health and occupational problems, and these include absenteeism, missed work, presenteeism, which is the phenomenon where the person comes to work, but they're really not well enough, they're not feeling well, and so they're not able to perform. And it's also associated with diminished work performance overall, with greater job turnover, work-related injuries, and chronic disability. It's associated with a number of different medical illnesses, including coronary artery disease, as well as with psychological distress, particularly depression, which we'll talk about. And overall, it's associated with increased mortality. So one thing that's important to recognize is that burnout is not simply overwork. This is not the response that a person might have to, say, a seasonal change in the work schedule. Many of us are aware that there are professions that have seasonal deadlines and people tend to work a lot of long hours during those periods. That is not the same as this experience of burnout, nor is it the same as just simple physical exhaustion. You've had a number of long days or a particularly arduous time at work, and so people are maybe very tired when they get home from work. They're using the weekend to kind of catch up and get some rest. And neither of those phenomena are the same as burnout. The thing about physical exhaustion is that it responds to rest, it responds to nutrition, it responds to a little time off. The same is true for overwork. The person gets a break, the schedule goes back to normal, and they begin to feel better. Those situations are different from burnout, which has these psychological and interpersonal characteristics. One of the things that people have studied are the kinds of conditions that give rise to this experience of emotional exhaustion and reduced professional accomplishment and cynicism that we're calling burnout. Some of these factors that have been identified include a sense of low job control. Many of us are familiar with the phrase. It's often considered to be a significant work-related problem of having responsibility without authority. The person who has responsibility without authority is in a difficult spot. Well, that seems to be associated with this experience of burnout. Likewise, another significant contributor to burnout is the sense of low workplace support. my supervisors, my coworkers don't support me, or I have antagonistic relationships with them, and that contributes to this experience of emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and loss of professional accomplishment. Now, there are some other factors that aren't as strongly related as those two with burnout, and these include things like jobs that have emotional demands associated with them. So this could be working with patients or working with people who are experiencing significant suffering. Emotional job demands can be a significant contributor. Also, some of the things that we're just talking about as distinct from burnout can be contributors to burnout. So if I have a high workload and maybe I have that for an unsustainable period of time, that could contribute to burnout, even if overwork is not the same thing as burnout. Also, if I have a job where I am very unlikely to have significant rewards associated with it. Perhaps most of the people that one works with are dissatisfied with the situation. Maybe the people that are that the person is serving are dissatisfied with the situation. These low reward environments also seem to contribute to burnout. And then finally, situations where there's either unspecified job demands, the person doesn't know what's required of them, or their job is insecure, otherwise insecure, that they could feel as though they could be fired or dismissed at any point. Those kinds of stressful situations can contribute to the experience of burnout. If we dig a little deeper to what it is that leads to the response, the burnout response in these difficult employment situations, we can begin to see some aspects of what it is to be human and how our very humanity, in a way, sets us up for this experience that we call burnout. One of my favorite philosophers is William Desmond, and Desmond talks about human beings as porous. He says we're porous in that we're open to the world and we're open to each other. We can be touched or moved by the world, and we're affected by the experiences we have. And because of that, when we're in these environments, particularly if they're high stress environments or they have significant emotional demands associated with them, or we're responsible for caring for people, or maybe we're in a first responder type of situation and it's even a life or death type of response, these situations affect us significantly. And we may try to protect ourselves by, if you will, this is a phrase Desmond uses, clogging our pores. So we could try to protect ourselves by disconnecting from these situations. Sometimes people talk about this particular response in stressful employment environments as secondary traumatic stress, or compassion fatigue, or empathic stress fatigue. These are efforts on the part of the worker to just buffer the effects of the environment. And it's understandable that this is what a person would do. Unfortunately, it also seems to be a significant contributor to this experience we're calling burnout. I want to just quote, this is from a book that was written by a psychiatrist about the experience of working with people who are suffering. He says, "What's passed in the air is people's pain, and you just can't rinse it off your clothes in the washing machine. Perhaps absorbing some pain is the cost of helping people." So we see that there is this way that our porosity leads us to feel some of this pain. This is the vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatic stress that is inevitable in many helping professions or vocations. And so one of the things that we have to consider when we talk about how to prevent and how to address burnout is how we're going to respond to these inevitable aspects of fear and grief that occur in helping professions and vocations. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, Are we allowed to feel? Are we allowed to remain porous? Or is it we're going to try to protect ourselves by moving in the direction of burnout? One of the other really significant aspects of burnout is this sense that the person is giving and giving and giving, and there's not much in it for them. The sense of unfair work demands is often a contributor to the experience of burnout. Now, I think there are a variety of reasons for this, and we might even see that it's related to what we were just talking about, that if the person feels as though they're the victim of injustice in their workplace, they might try to harden themselves to it or numb themselves to it. But there's a way that this sense of the fairness of things and the relative balance of giving and getting can actually contribute to burnout itself. And I often refer to this as the problem of the hidden ledger, that we have expectations that are associated with our efforts that we're not necessarily looking at. When we examine what's going on, though, we might see that we're engaging in what I would call transactional thinking. In other words, we're asking the question, what's in this for me? And when we ask that question, it tends to emphasize the instrumental dimension of the activities in which we're engaged. So we begin to look at what it is we're doing in terms of a balance sheet and, whether there's as much coming in as is going out. And then that tends to have us focused on unfairness. And the problem with this is that the more that we scan for unfairness, the more focused we become on it, and the more likely we are to see it. We also end up focusing entirely on this outcome. Right? So am I getting what I'm supposed to get out of this? And if I'm focusing on the outcome, I'm not necessarily focusing on the task. I often say it this way: if it's all about the outcome likely won't be good. So we have to consider that when we're focused on this sense of fairness or this outcome or this balance, we're losing touch with what it is that we're doing and the rewarding aspects of the doing. If the doing, as opposed to the outcome, is insufficiently rewarding, it's unlikely to be a sustainable activity. It's more likely than not to yield burnout. So this inability to balance the ledger and this focus on the ledger, what I'm getting relative to what I'm giving, that can lead to a sense of disappointment, cynicism, resentment, depletion, all of the things that we're associating with burnout. As this continues, it can build on itself to the point that it can result in clinical depression. And we might even consider depression, at least one pathway to depression would be as a psychological effect of burnout. So there was some very important work on depression done in the 1970s by Peter Levison, a behavioral theory of depression, in which he noted that people who were prone to depression were often experiencing situations where they were deprived of rewards. There were very few rewards for what they were doing. And when they didn't experience much reinforcement for their efforts, they tended to withdraw. And when they withdrew from activities, they lost interest in them. Then they began to evaluate themselves negatively, thinking that they weren't worth much, that they didn't do much. They tended to neglect their responsibilities because they didn't really derive much in the way of praise or other forms of reward for engaging in the activities. And in a relatively brief time, they began to experience a sense of ineffectiveness, hopelessness, and then even at some points, as the spiral continued, a sense that life wasn't worth living. So that's a pathway from burnout to depression. Also, burnout is characterized by this lack of interpersonal empathy, kind of cynicism, tends to be presented interpersonally as irritability or apathy. When people interact with others in that way, sometimes what other people will do is disengage and remove responsibilities or workload or expectations from them. And so in that way, there could be a negative reinforcement for the behaviors that we associate with burnout. If I act in a way that's grumpy or detached or disconnected or uninvolved, people will give me less to do. And I'll actually experience a little bit of relief, even though I'm quite unhappy with my situation. And so in that way, burnout can be maintained by negative reinforcement. And that also, because the person becomes detached, less engaged, less productive, could contribute ultimately to depression. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we have in encountering difficult situations. And I think that one of the things that we're focused on here is how to not only address burnout when it shows up, but also how to prevent it. And probably the best thing that we can do to prevent burnout is to allow ourselves to experience the difficult emotions, including frustration, that are often associated with demanding jobs and vocations. So our minds tend to be protective. We might even notice that the word mind, when we talk about the human mind, that word is one that we use in situations that involve protection, like who's minding the store, who's minding the children. Our minds actually have a pretty important role for us in protecting us from danger and solving problems and removing threats. And so one of the things that happens for us when we're in these challenging situations is that we'll often try to protect ourselves from our own emotional experience. In other words, we'll even identify our own sadness, our own experience of fear, our own sense of disappointment as a kind of threat to be removed. Now, we run into a problem here, and that is that trying to rid ourselves of our own experiences is a very difficult thing to do, and one that's really not very effective. And oftentimes the things that the mind tries to do to try to get rid of frightening or frustrating experiences actually end up kind of intensifying the problems that we're having. So for instance, we might try to respond to a difficult situation by hardening our emotional stance, by numbing ourselves, or by worrying or by withdrawing from the situations. But that can actually leave us feeling, as we were just talking about, depleted. It can leave us feeling emotionally exhausted. It can be perceived by others as irritable or uncaring, and so it leads us to be less effective. And despite the fact that the mind is trying to protect us from unpleasant emotional experiences, the end result is actually more unpleasant and more difficult because it contributes to all those problems that we're talking about relative to burnout. So what is going on here? How is it that our mind, which is such an amazing problem-solving, protective part of what it is to be human, is actually contributing to our distress? Well, this has to do with what the psychologist Daniel Wegner called the ironic process of mind. Wegner is famous for a study that he did where he had two groups of people, and he showed both groups a picture of a polar bear. And he had them, both groups, he had people look at the polar bear, get a good mental image of it, and then he gave them each different instructions afterward. To one group, he said, what I want you to do for the next 20 minutes is think about whatever you want, and then tell us what you've been thinking about. And what he said to the other group was, for the next 20 minutes, I'd like you to think about whatever you want, except don't think about a white bear, and tell us what you've been thinking about. Well, most people know intuitively that the group that was told not to think about the white bear would be the group that thought about the white bear the most. And that is in fact true, that the group that Wegner asked to not think about the polar bear reported that they thought about the polar bear throughout the 20 minutes. What is a little bit more surprising and perhaps even more telling about burnout is that what Wegner found was that the group that he told not to think about the white bear not only thought about it more during the 20-minute exercise, they reported intrusive images of white bears for 3 days afterwards. And so there's this intriguing aspect of the human mind that when it tries to protect us from unwanted inner experiences, whether it's memories, whether it's emotions, whatever it might be, it actually ends up thinking about those difficult experiences more, bringing them more into our awareness, and sometimes in ways that are disruptive and even intrusive. And that, I think, is a key characteristic of burnout, that the person is trying to get away from unwanted experiences, whether it's the demands of the job, the lack of coworker support, whether it's the sense of unfairness, that the ledger isn't balanced, whatever it is, the person's trying to get away from it. And by numbing themselves, by, as Desmond would say, clogging their pores, but nevertheless, because of that ironic process of mind, the very things that the person is trying to get away from are actually intensifying. And those efforts at getting away, they might succeed a little bit, perhaps by hardening oneself, by withdrawing from the work environment, by taking a cynical attitude. The person might get some modicum of disconnection. But nevertheless, the demands remain and the unwanted emotions remain. And so the person gets stuck in a kind of vicious cycle of trying to get rid of what it is that they can't get rid of. So what we're talking about here is a difficult aspect of the human mind. What we're talking about is something that is characteristic of the human response to distress. And a number of different approaches are available to us when we experience this. There's a psychologist whose name is Paul Gilbert. He wrote an excellent book called The Compassionate Mind, who has taken the psychological response to these difficult situations and divided it into two groups. And the sort of two groups of responses are what he calls the psychology of engagement and the psychology of alleviation. The psychology of engagement is the process of turning toward these difficult experiences. It's the means by which one might engage with suffering, feeling one's emotional experience rather than trying to suppress it or avoid it or escape it. So that's the psychology of engagement. At the same time, Gilbert says there's another class of responses to difficult situations that he calls the psychology of alleviation. And this set of behaviors is about the wisdom and the care that allow us to engage meaningfully with ourselves and with others in difficult situations. So the psychology of alleviation is about taking meaningful action in the presence of suffering. So some of this, it would include things like forgiveness and kindness and concern for the well-being of others and oneself. So we can see how the psychology of engagement, if I'm going to be open to the distress that I experience, because fighting it or trying to negate it only allows it to come back with greater intensity, right? Because of that ironic process of mind, it comes back with greater intensity. So rather than fight it, I'm going to be open to it. I'm going to have greater sensitivity to it. I'm going to accept the experience. I'm going to try to develop a tolerance for the distress of the experience. And I'm going to be willing to be open as a person in the face of distress. If I'm going to do that, it's going to become possible only because of the psychology of alleviation, where I cultivate kindness for myself, kindness towards others, concern for the well-being of myself and others, I am going to use, as part of the psychology of alleviation, language and imagery that evokes warmth and wisdom and strength. And this is a deliberately soothing interpersonal strategy. The goal here is, through support for oneself and others in this compassionate way, to turn toward the difficult experiences that occur in challenging jobs and challenging caregiving situations, and that together the psychology of engagement and the psychology of alleviation can both prevent burnout and give us an opportunity to respond constructively when burnout has occurred. So we might say that what we're doing in this alternative response is making room for some of the distress that we're almost inevitably going to encounter because of our vulnerability as human beings. And one of the things that we might be able to recognize is that no matter what it is we encounter, we really are larger than any emotional experience we might have. That, in a sense, we're not necessarily the emotions that we feel. We're the space in which those emotions play out. And so we could create a more generous or more capacious sense of self that would allow us to experience some of the difficult things that occur in stressful jobs and vocations and make room for them. There's a wonderful poem by Rumi. It's quite an ancient poem in a modern translation called The Guest House, that gets at this way of relating to our emotional experience. And that poem, I'll just share it with you now. It goes like this. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So you see that in this approach to burnout, we're deliberately, according to Gilbert's idea of the psychology of engagement, turning toward these difficult emotions and making room for them, allowing them to be there so that we don't have to engage in this defensive effort to exclude them. We don't have to engage in all of the self-protective efforts to minimize our experience of distress, because we can allow it to be there, recognizing that we are not our distress, but rather the space in which distress occurs. There's also, I think, an important way that we can recognize that our distress says something wonderfully beautiful about us as human beings. There's a Zen saying that I'll often use when I'm working with someone who's experiencing burnout or depression, and it goes like this. Beneath anger, fear. Beneath fear, grief. Beneath grief, love. Beneath love, the clear blue sky. I'll just read that again. Beneath anger, fear. Beneath fear, grief. Beneath grief, love.